On Christmas Eve, my son-in-law grabbed the hand-carved cherrywood box I had spent 2 months working on and tossed it straight into the fireplace ash bin. He didn't even look at me. He just sneered, "Cheap country junk," and walked away to grab another glass of champagne. I stood there in my old suit, feeling the heat of the fire on my face, and didn't say a word. 10 minutes later, in the drafty corridor near the front door, my daughter Sarah cornered me. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't look at the coat I was trying to button with stiff fingers. She just looked at me with cold, embarrassed eyes and said, "Dad, you have two choices tonight. You either walk back in there and apologize to Victor and his mother, or you leave and you grow old alone." 3 weeks later, I bought a one-way ticket out of New York. But what I left behind in their mailbox would turn my daughter's face pale the moment she opened it. She would finally understand the exact cost of what they had thrown in the trash. My name is Arthur Miller. I am 59 years old, and for 35 years, I built custom kitchens and historic wood installations in New York. I know how to make things that last. I know how to select the right cut of oak, how to calculate the load-bearing weight of a ceiling beam, and how to sand a joint until it feels like silk. But I didn't know how to build a relationship with a daughter who had decided that my working-class hands were a stain on her new, wealthy life. There are two kinds of cold in New York in December. The first kind bites your face the moment you step off the train, wind coming raw off the water. I knew that one well. I had spent decades working on freezing job sites. But the other kind waits inside a room filled with people who have decided you don't belong there. I was still learning that second cold as I rode the train into Manhattan. I wore a Navy suit bought in 2009 for Martha's cousin's wedding. Martha had stood behind me in the mirror at Macy's, smoothing the shoulders, and said I looked like a man who built something worth wearing a suit for. I kept it because of that memory. Since she passed away 3 years ago, Sarah's visits grew rare. I started showing up to dinners early and quiet, hoping the work was still mine. The cherrywood box sat on my lap the whole ride. Inside, wrapped in green felt, was a wooden horse the size of my fist, its mane carved in individual strokes. It wasn't a store-bought toy. It took patience rather than money. I had worked on it every evening in October and November at my kitchen table, letting shavings fall into Martha's old mixing bowl. Grace was 7 years old, and she had told me she wished she had a horse. I hadn't forgotten. The Thornton residence on the Upper East Side was a building that made the street feel like a stage. It had a white limestone facade, a doorman in a coat that cost more than my first truck, and string lights that glowed with the quiet restraint of serious wealth. I stood on the pavement for a second, my breath fogging in the air, and straightened my collar. Beatrice Thornton, Victor's mother, opened the door. She was a tall, silver-haired woman in a dress the color of red wine. Her smile was technically perfect, like a well-drafted contract, but had no warmth. "Arthur," she said, extending a hand. "How punctual. Come in. It's absolutely dreadful outside." The entry hall smelled of expensive pine and crystal. There were 15 people in the main room, the women in silk gowns and the men in dark tailored suits. A string quartet played somewhere in the background. "I'm afraid the main table is fully committed tonight," Beatrice said, her eyes making a quick, practiced scan of my suit and my shoes. "Victor has some of his development partners and their families here, and the seating had to be arranged very carefully. We've set up a smaller, more comfortable table for you near the kitchen corridor. It's much more intimate. I'm sure you understand that our guests have certain expectations for the atmosphere." Victor was standing near the fireplace, laughing with 3 men. Sarah stood beside him in a deep blue gown. Her hand was on his arm. Our eyes met for exactly 3 seconds. Then she turned back to the woman next to her and smiled, pretending she hadn't seen her father standing by the door. "Of course," I told Beatrice. "Lead the way." The table was a small, round two-top tucked behind a folding screen next to the swinging kitchen doors. Every time a waiter passed, the screen rattled slightly. There was a single water glass and a plate with 1 bread roll. I set my cherrywood box on the empty chair beside me and sat down. From where I sat, I could see the long, gleaming main table and the backs of the people who were deemed appropriate to sit there. I poured myself some water and watched my daughter laugh. I thought about the kitchen table on Merrick Road, where she had done her homework for 12 years, and how Martha would always bring her a glass of milk without saying a word, just placing it down because she knew quiet support was the best kind. I was thinking about that when I heard light, fast footsteps. Grace appeared from behind the folding screen like a little green highlight. Her velvet dress was already dusty, and her hair was escaping its ribbons. In her hand she held a small red plastic device. "Grandpa Arthur," she said out of breath. "I found you. You always do, Grace," I said, leaning down to hug her. She threw her arms around my neck with the complete, honest energy that only children have. "What's that you've got?" I asked, pointing to the red toy. "My reporter recorder," she said, holding it up proudly. "Miss Patterson at school said a good reporter is always ready. I record important things. I recorded the soup boiling this morning, and the fireplace, and Daddy talking on his phone." She pressed a button and a tiny red light started blinking. "I'm going to record the party now." She set the recorder on the white tablecloth next to my plate with the serious focus of a professional establishing her workspace. She climbed onto the chair beside me, and for the first time that night, the tightness in my chest eased a little. Grace sat with her chin resting on her small hands, watching the waiters move back and forth between the kitchen doors and the main dining room. She picked up my clean dessert spoon and turned it over, looking at her upside-down reflection in the polished metal with the quiet focus of a scientist conducting an experiment. "I already ate my dinner in the kitchen," she told me, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Daddy said the food out here was only for the grown-ups, but I wanted to sit with you anyway." "Is that okay?" "It's more than okay," I said, leaning in. "I was hoping for some good company tonight. It's much better than sitting alone." Grace smiled, her small shoulders relaxing. She was a bright child, always observing everything with a curious, serious gaze. For the next 20 minutes she sat beside me and shared her observations about the party. She told me the soup course had been too salty, but in a good way, that the string quartet was playing a song she knew from a movie, but couldn't remember the name of, and that the woman in the bright red dress near the fireplace laughed exactly like a sea lion. To prove her point, she cupped her hands over her mouth and did a quiet, muffled imitation of the laugh, making me chuckles. It was the first real laugh I had managed all evening, the kind that came from the chest and cleared out some of the heavy air. "You're a very good observer," I told her, smiling. "Miss Patterson says that's the most important job for a reporter," Grace said. She picked up the small red plastic recorder she had placed near my bread plate. She held it with both hands, pointing it toward the main room where the chatter and the clinking of glasses were getting louder. "I've been recording this whole time. The party sounds different than I thought it would." "How did you think it would sound?" I asked. She looked at the small blinking red light, then out at the room filled with people in expensive clothes. "Happier," she said simply. I didn't know how to answer that. A 7-year-old child had managed to summarize the entire atmosphere of the room in a single word. So instead of trying to explain, I reached into the breast pocket of my navy suit and pulled out a photograph. It was a picture I had been carrying with me since September, printed at the Walgreens on Merrick Road because the original had started to curl at the edges. It was a photograph of Martha from the summer of 2018. She was standing on the front steps of our house, one hand raised to block the bright afternoon sun, her head tilted back as she laughed at something I had said. The light in the photo was that golden, warm color of a Long Island July, making the whole scene look like a memory of a time when everything was simple. "Can I show you something?" I asked Grace. She lowered her red recorder immediately, leaning in close the way children do when they know they are about to see something real. I placed the photograph on the white tablecloth between us. Grace studied it for a long, quiet moment. "She's laughing really hard," Grace said, pointing a finger at Martha's face. "She always did," I said. "Martha had a way of finding what was funny about a situation, even when things weren't going the way we planned. She was very good at that. I remember her hands," Grace said softly, her eyes still on the photo. "They were soft. She let me braid her hair once when I came to visit. I was only 5, so it wasn't very neat. But she told me it was beautiful and wore it like that for the whole afternoon. My throat did something tight and unexpected. I had to press my thumb against the corner of my eye to stop a tear, then cleared my throat. She would have been very glad to hear you remember that, Grace. She talked about that afternoon for a long time. Grace nodded slowly, accepting this. She picked up the red recorder and held it close to the photograph. I'm going to record this too, she announced, pressing the button to make the red light blink. I was watching her small face, the serious frown of concentration, when I heard footsteps behind me. They weren't the fast, light steps of the kitchen staff. They were slow, heavy, and deliberate, the rhythm of a man who wanted everyone to know he owned the ground he walked on. Victor stopped beside our table. He looked down at the photograph with the brief, dismissive glance he gave to everything that didn't fit into his world of property developments and luxury contracts. "What is this doing out here?" Victor asked. His voice wasn't loud, but it had the flat, hard edge of a demand. "Arthur, a personal photograph at a formal dinner table? It looks completely out of place." Grace looked up, her chin rising. "We were looking at Grandma Martha. This isn't the time or the place," Victor said. He reached down and picked up the photograph with 2 fingers, holding it as if it were dirty. Without looking at me, he flagged down a passing waiter who was carrying a tray of dirty glasses to the kitchen. "Take this to the back, please." The waiter, a young kid who looked exhausted, took the photo without registering what it was and kept walking. The photograph of my wife disappeared behind the kitchen doors. Grace's mouth opened in shock. Her eyes went wide and glassy as she looked at me, her small body freezing. She had never seen an adult behave that way, and she didn't know how to process it. "Grandpa Arthur," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry. It's okay, Grace," I said. I pressed my hands flat on the table, feeling the texture of the cloth, forcing my voice to remain steady. "Come here." She climbed off her chair and stood beside me. I put my arm around her shoulders, and she pressed her face into my navy jacket. I could feel her breathing in the shaky, uneven way of a child trying very hard not to cry in a room full of strangers. "That wasn't your fault," I whispered into her hair. "Not a single bit of it." Victor had already turned and walked back to the main table, adjusting his cuffs as if he had just cleared away a piece of clutter. Grace pulled back after a moment, her face flushed. With a quick, silent gesture, she reached up and slipped the small red recorder into the breast pocket of my jacket. "For safekeeping," she whispered, her eyes serious. "So nothing happens to it." "Good thinking," I said, patting the pocket. The small plastic device sat there, a tiny weight against my chest. Grace left about 20 minutes after Victor took the photograph. A woman in a black uniform appeared at the edge of the folding screen and announced that it was 8:30, which meant it was time for Grace's bath. Grace looked at me with the reluctant expression of a child being called away from a place she actually wanted to be, back to the structured rules of the house. She hugged me once more, squeezing my neck with all her strength, and then she reached toward my pocket to retrieve her red recorder. I watched her tuck it under her arm as she followed the woman in black toward the wide curved staircase in the main hall. I thought she had taken it with her, and I quickly forgot about the small device as the silence of my corner settled back over me. I sat alone at the small round table for another 10 minutes. The party moved and breathed around me, entirely indifferent to my presence. A waiter refilled my water glass without making eye contact, his movements quick and mechanical. From the main room, the sound of laughter rose and fell, pitched at the polite, artificial frequency of people performing enjoyment for one another's benefit. The string quartet had moved on to a slow, classical piece I didn't recognize. Then Sarah appeared. She came around the folding screen quickly, the way she always moved when she was trying to avoid being seen doing something she found uncomfortable. Her shoulders were slightly tense, and her eyes scanned the corridor before settling on me. She was wearing a gown the color of deep water, and her hair was pinned up in a style that looked elegant but tight. She looked exhausted, with the specific fragile fatigue of someone who had been playing a role since Sixas. "Dad," she said, sitting down in the chair Grace had just vacated. She leaned in close, keeping her voice at a whisper that wouldn't carry past the folding screen. "You should really circulate a little. It looks strange, you sitting back here in the corner all evening." "I was invited to sit here, Sarah," I said, keeping my voice level. Gloria arranged the seating, So I am sitting where I was placed. I'm not complaining. Sarah pressed her lips together, a familiar line of frustration appearing between her eyebrows. That's not how it was meant. Dad, it's just a seating arrangement because Victor's business partners are here tonight. It's about business. I understand exactly how it was meant, I said, looking at her. And I'm not making a fuss. I'm sitting here, eating my dinner, and I had a nice talk with Grace. You don't need to worry about me. Sarah looked away, something complicated moving across her face. A mixture of guilt and relief that she couldn't quite hide. She reached out and touched my hand, a brief, dry gesture before her eyes fell on the cherrywood box sitting on the empty chair. "What's that?" she asked. "I brought something for Grace," I said. I lifted the heavy cherrywood box and placed it on the table in front of her. "I wanted to give it to her tonight. Go ahead, open it." Sarah lifted the lid. The wooden horse sat in its square of green felt, its polished surface catching the warm light of the candle. She ran her thumb slowly along the curve of the carved mane, feeling the smooth individual strokes I had spent hours sanding. Her breath hitched slightly. "Dad," she whispered, "you made this?" "Every evening in October and November," I said. At the kitchen table, Martha's old mixing bowl was underneath to catch the shavings. She was still staring at the horse when Victor arrived. He stepped around the folding screen, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, moving with the easy, casual authority of a man who knew he owned the room. He stopped behind Sarah's shoulder, looking down at the open box with a slight frown. "What is that?" Victor asked. "Arthur made it for Grace," Sarah said. "I noticed she used my name instead of Dad, the way she always did when Victor was around, as if trying to distance herself from my world." Victor set his glass on the table and reached into the box. He picked up the wooden horse, holding it at arm's length and turning it over in his hand with the dismissive inspection of a man evaluating cheap goods at a garage sale. "You brought a hand-carved toy to this house?" Victor said. His voice was flat, carrying no anger, just a cold certainty. "Arthur, Grace has a playroom full of handcrafted European imports, educational pieces. This looks like scrap wood from a job site. The edges here are rough. She could easily scratch herself. The edges are sanded to 80 grit, then to 220. I said, my voice quiet. "I've been working with wood for 35 years, Victor. I know how to finish a piece so it's safe for a child." Victor looked at me over the wooden horse, his eyes clear and indifferent. He didn't argue. Instead, he dropped the horse into the waste bin beside the fireplace hearth. The sound of the wood hitting the bottom of the bin was loud and final. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide, but she didn't say a single word to her husband. She didn't tell him to pick it up. She just sat there, silent. From the corner of my eye, I saw a movement near the kitchen doorway. A middle-aged woman in a gray domestic uniform, Helen Jenkins, was standing by the serving shelf. She had been arranging clean glasses, but now she was completely still, watching the waste bin and then watching me. Without a word, and without drawing the attention of anyone in the main room, Helen crossed the tiled floor, reached into the waste bin, and slipped the wooden horse into the deep pocket of her apron. She met my eyes for exactly 1 second, gave a tiny nod, and went back to her work. I stood up. I didn't rush. I stood up the way I always stood up from a workbench when a project was finished, deliberately and completely. I reached for my navy jacket on the back of the chair and put it on, buttoning the front button. "Dad," Sarah whispered, her voice low and urgent. "Please not here. Don't make a scene." "I'm not making a scene, Sarah," I said. I looked at Victor, who had retrieved his glass and was watching me with the calm indifference of a man who had never had to wonder if he belonged. "I've built a lot of homes in my life, Victor. I have never once been in a house where the host threw a guest's gift into the trash in front of his face and called it hospitality." I turned and walked out, not fast, and without looking back at Sarah's face. If I looked at her, I knew I would stop, and I had no intention of stopping. The December air outside hit me like a solid hand on the chest. It was cold, immediate, and honest. I stood on the limestone sidewalk for a moment, drawing the freezing air deep into my lungs, letting it clear the smell of expensive perfume and candle wax from my nose. I pulled my collar up against the wind and started walking toward the subway station. Penn Station on Christmas Eve smells like soft pretzels, diesel exhaust, and the general damp desperation of people trying to get somewhere before the clocks strike midnight. I took the train down to 34th Street, standing the entire way. The subway car was half full of people holding wet shopping bags and holiday packages, all of them staring at the floor or the advertisements above the doors with the tired, distant gaze of people who had spent too much energy pretending to be happy. I fit right in. When I reached the main hall of the station, the departure board was clicking through its updates with the indifference of a system that ran on schedule regardless of what the people underneath it were going through. My train back to Long Island, the 8:52 to Merrick, was scheduled to leave in 14 minutes. I bought a coffee in a paper cup that had Happy Holidays printed on the side and stood in the middle of the concourse, drinking the hot, bitter liquid and looking at the board. My mind drifted back to the spring of 1987. Martha and I had stood in this exact spot, heading back to Long Island after a dinner with her sister. We had missed our train by 2 minutes and had to wait 45 minutes on a wooden bench near the newsstand. Martha had bought a crossword puzzle and spent the entire time reading the clues out loud, laughing at my terrible suggestions. We had no money back then, a mortgage we could barely afford, and a broken heater in our old truck. But sitting on that hard bench with Martha's head resting on my shoulder, I had been the happiest man alive. "Dad!" The voice broke through my thoughts. I turned and saw Sarah pushing through the crowd. Her winter coat was only half buttoned, the buttons matched to the wrong holes, and her hair was starting to fall from the neat pins she had worn all evening. She had her phone in her hand and was looking at me with an expression that was half anger and half exhaustion. She stopped 2 feet away, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. "Dad, stop! Just stop!" "I'm not moving, Sarah," I said, holding my coffee cup. "I'm just waiting for my train." "Do you have any idea what you just did in there?" she asked, her voice cracking slightly as she tried to keep it low enough for the passing commuters not to hear. "Victor is absolutely furious. His mother is furious. The partners are asking questions. Do you understand what this means for me? For my life?" "I know what happened, Sarah," I said, looking at her. "Victor took the only photograph I have of your mother and gave it to a waiter to carry away like it was garbage. Then he threw my gift into the trash. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't start a fight. I just left. It was a toy, Dad," she said, her hands shaking as she gripping her phone. "It was just a wooden toy, and you made it into this huge thing. You walked out and embarrassed me in front of the people I have to live with every day. I'm always the one who has to clean up the mess. I'm always the one who has to apologize." I looked at my daughter. She was 34 years old, standing in the middle of Penn Station on Christmas Eve, and she was shaking. But she wasn't shaking because she was cold. She was shaking because she was terrified of the world she had chosen to live in. A world where a wooden toy was an embarrassment, and an insult to her dead mother's memory was something to be ignored for the sake of appearances. "I spent 2 months carving that horse for Grace," I said, "and the photograph was the one of Martha laughing on the steps. You stood on those steps, Sarah. You remember that day." "I have spent 3 years, Dad," she said, her eyes bright with wet, angry tears. 3 years learning how to live in that world, how to talk, what to wear, how to smile when I want to scream. I did all of that so I could have a secure life. A life where I don't have to worry about the bills the way you and Mom did. And you walked in tonight and threw all of it away because your feelings got hurt." "My feelings didn't get hurt, Sarah," I said, keeping my voice level. "My self-respect did. There's a difference. Your mother would have understood that." "Mom isn't here," Sarah said, her voice rising before she caught herself. She straightened her spine, her chin coming up in a gesture that looked exactly like Gloria Thornton's. "You have 2 choices, Dad. You either go back to the apartment tonight and apologize to Victor and Beatrice, or you go home to Merrick Road and you stay there alone. I can't keep doing this. I can't keep being the bridge between your world and mine. Your pride is not worth my marriage." The departure board clicked. The 8:52 to Merrick was displayed in white letters on the screen. I looked at my daughter's face, searching for some trace of Martha. I looked at the shape of her jaw, the color of her eyes, The traces were there, but they were buried under years of trying to please people who valued appearance over substance. "When was the last time you apologized to me, Sarah?" I asked quietly. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her lips trembled slightly, and she looked away. "Merry Christmas, sweetheart," I said. I walked over to the trash can, dropped my half-empty paper cup inside, and walked toward the train gates. I didn't look back. Behind me, she called my name once, but I kept walking, my boots clicking against the hard tile floor. The train ride back to Long Island was long and quiet. I sat by the window, watching the dark suburban stations slide past in the cold December night. When the train finally pulled into Merrick, I got off and walked the 6 blocks to my house. The street was empty, the snow starting to fall in thin, dry flakes that swirled under the streetlights. My house on Merrick Road looked exactly the same as when I had left it that afternoon. In some ways, that was the hardest part. The porch light was on, casting a warm yellow glow across the wooden steps. I had left it on out of habit, a routine from when Sarah was a teenager, and I wanted her to know that someone was awake and waiting for her to come home. On the front door hung the pine wreath Martha had made 3 winters ago, its needles dry and brown at the edges, but still holding its shape. I unlocked the door, stepped into the dark hallway, and hung my navy jacket on the wooden peg by the door. The house was completely silent, holding only the cold, still air of a home where no one had lived for a long time. I walked into the kitchen, turned on the single overhead light, and sat down at the table. I didn't even take off my boots, something Martha would have immediately corrected me for. I just sat there, looking at my hands on the clean wood surface, feeling the exhaustion of the evening finally catch up with me. As I leaned back in the chair, my hand brushed against my jacket hanging on the hook in the hallway. I felt a small, hard rectangle in the breast pocket. I stood up, reached into the pocket, and pulled out the small red plastic recorder Grace had been playing with. I was surprised. I had distinctively remembered watching her retrieve it before she left with the nanny, but then I recalled the heavy, desperate hug she had given me before she walked away. Her small arms wrapping around my neck. She must have slipped it back into my pocket during that final hug, a secret gesture to keep it safe. Or perhaps I had simply been too distracted by my own thoughts to notice she hadn't taken it. The small red light on the side of the device was dark. The battery had finally run out. I found a micro USB cable in the kitchen drawer, plugged it into the wall, and connected the recorder. A tiny green charging light flickered on. I sat back down at the table, let it charge for a few minutes, and then pressed the play button. The first sounds were exactly what I expected. The muffled chatter of the party, the clinking of champagne glasses, and the distant, echoing notes of the string quartet. Then came the sound of Grace's voice, clear and bright, and my own voice, rougher and older than I realized, telling her that missing someone wasn't about how many times you met them, but about what they left behind in the room. Hearing my own words in the quiet kitchen made my chest tighten, but the recording didn't stop when Grace left. The little device had stayed in my pocket, its microphone pointed outward through the thin wool of my navy suit. It had recorded everything while I sat alone at the small table near the kitchen corridor, waiting for Sarah to come speak to me. About 40 minutes into the recording, the ambient noise of the party suddenly faded, replaced by 2 familiar voices speaking in hushed, urgent tones. They were standing right on the other side of the folding screen, near the serving shelf where the waiters kept the clean plates. They must have stepped away from the main dining table to have a private conversation, completely ignoring the fact that I was sitting just a few feet away, hidden by the screen. It was Victor's voice first, low and sharp, stripped of the polite warmth he used for his business partners. "She signed the Merrick Road property transfer papers last spring, Mother," Victor said. "She thought they were standard insurance updates for the estate. I had them mixed in with the medical release forms." Beatrice's voice replied, unhurried and calm, like she was reading a shopping list. "And the LLC, his contractor's license?" "Already in motion," Victor answered. "Once the transfer clears the county registry, we won't need his name attached to the firm anymore. The bank will approve the funding using our new LLC, not his old company. He won't even know his license was used to secure the historic preservation contract." There was a short pause, the sound of a glass being set down on the wooden shelf. "And Sarah?" Beatrice asked. "Does she know?" "Sarah knows what I tell her," Victor said, his voice flat and cold. "She doesn't ask questions as long as the credit cards work." I pressed the stop button. The tape ended with a soft click, and the quiet of the Merrick Road kitchen rushed back to fill the room. I sat there, perfectly still, looking at the watercolor painting Martha had done of our backyard, that hung on the wall next to the refrigerator. She had gotten the light wrong on the oak tree, but the red roses were painted with a detail that made them look alive. My hands were flat on the kitchen table. I looked at them. The knuckle on my right index finger was crooked, broken on a framing job in 1994 and never set quite right. The skin was rough, covered in the calluses of a man who had spent his life working with physical materials, building structures that stood straight and held up under the weight of the world. My hands were not shaking. I stood up, walked to the wall phone by the door, and dialed a number I knew by heart. It rang twice before a groggy but alert voice answered. "Walter," I said, my voice steady, "I need you to come over tomorrow morning, 9. Walter Higgins lived in a two-family house in Woodside, Queens that he had bought in 1993 and renovated entirely by himself over the next 4 years, working on weekends and holidays. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders from decades of actual physical labor, with hands that looked like they belonged on someone much larger. He had retired from construction site management 4 years ago, but he still carried the sharp, impatient energy of a man who spent his life making sure projects got built on time and according to the blueprints. In 38 years of friendship, Walter was the most reliable person I knew. We had worked on dozens of projects together across Long Island and Queens, and I knew that if Walter said a wall was plumb, it was plumb. On Christmas morning, Walter arrived at my house at exactly 9 Liff. He didn't ask questions when he came through the door. He just carried a cardboard tray with 2 large cups of black coffee from the deli down the street and set them on the kitchen table. He took off his heavy winter coat, hung it on the peg next to mine, and sat down. "You sound like you haven't slept," Walter said, looking at me with his sharp gray eyes. "And you look like you're still wearing the suit from last night. What happened?" I didn't answer right away. I sat down across from him, pulled the red plastic recorder out of my pocket, and set it on the table between us. I pressed play, adjusting the volume so we could hear it clearly over the hum of the refrigerator. Walter sat perfectly still as the tape played. He listened to the background noise of the party, the quiet conversation I had with Grace, and then the sudden shift as Victor and Beatrice spoke on the other side of the screen. When Victor's voice mentioned the Merrick Road property transfer and the LLC registry, Walter's eyes narrowed. He didn't interrupt. He kept his hands wrapped around his coffee cup, his face hardening as the details of the fraud were laid out in Victor's cold, flat voice. When the recording ended with a soft click, Walter set his coffee cup down. He leaned back in his chair, his jaw working as he processed what he had just heard. "They forged your signature on the LLC registry documents," Walter said, his voice dropping into a low, hard register. "That's not just a business dispute, Arthur. In New York State, forging a signature on a legal contract or a corporate amendment is a felony. Under New York Penal Law, Section 170.10, that's forgery in the second degree. It's a Class D felony. It carries real prison time. They didn't just try to squeeze you out of the business. They committed a crime to do it. Victor has exposed himself to massive criminal liability here, and he doesn't even realize he left the evidence on a child's toy." "I figured it was illegal," I said, taking a sip of the lukewarm coffee, "but I didn't know the exact charge. What about the house?" "If Sarah signed papers transferring the deed to Merrick Road because Victor told her they were insurance updates, that's fraud in the inducement," Walter explained, tapping his finger on the table. "Legally, a transfer executed under that kind of material misrepresentation is voidable. You can file a civil action to have a judge declare the transfer null and void, as if it never happened. The property reverts back to your name." He paused, looking around the kitchen, then back at me. "But to do this right, you need a professional. You can't just walk into a police precinct with a toy recorder and expect them to handle it. You need a lawyer who knows business law and real estate, Someone who won't blink when Victor's high-priced firm starts throwing paperwork at us. Do you know someone? I asked. Diana Mercer, Walter said immediately. She handled that commercial contract dispute for my firm back in 2009. She is as sharp as they come, and she doesn't waste time on pleasantries. Her office is in Manhattan, on 6th Avenue. I'll call her first thing after the holidays. January 2nd at the earliest, but with the new year, it might be the 6th before she can see us. The 6th is fine, I said. I'm not in a rush to start a fight. I want to make sure we have everything lined up before we make a move. When you build a foundation, Walter, you don't pour the concrete until the frame is perfectly square. Walter nodded, his face relaxing slightly. He reached over, picked up his coffee cup, and took a drink. You're right, we don't rush. We collect the documents. We get the bank records, and we walk into Diana's office with a complete file. But what about Sarah? Have you talked to her since last night? She came to Penn Station, I said. She gave me an ultimatum. Either I go back and apologize to Victor and Gloria, or I go home to Merrick Road and you stay there alone. She told me my pride wasn't worth her marriage. Walter let out a short, harsh breath through his nose, a sound he made on job sites when a subcontractor tried to cut corners on a load-bearing wall. She doesn't know, does she? She has no idea what her husband is doing behind her back. No, I said. She doesn't know. Or if she suspects something is wrong, she's choosing not to look too closely because she likes the life Victor provides for her. Either way, she made her choice last night. So what are you going to do? Walter asked. I looked out the kitchen window. The snow was falling faster now, covering the backyard in a clean white blanket that hid all the rough patches in the dead grass. I thought about the workshop behind the house, the tools I had spent a lifetime collecting, and the memory of Martha laughing on the front steps. I'm going to take the third option, I said. After Walter left that Christmas morning, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, watching the snow gather on the branches of the old oak tree in the backyard. The house was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It was the silence of a workshop before the first cut is made, focused, deliberate, and waiting. Around 1:00 in the afternoon, the kitchen phone on the wall rang. I stood up and answered it, expecting it to be Sarah, perhaps calling to see if I had changed my mind about the apology. But the voice on the other end was unfamiliar. A woman's voice, speaking in a low, careful tone that carried a distinct nervousness. Mr. Miller, she said, my name is Helen Jenkins. I work as the housekeeper at the Thornton residence. I've been with the family for 11 years, Mr. Miller. I apologize for calling you on Christmas Day, but I wasn't sure I would have the courage to do it if I waited. My hand tightened slightly around the plastic receiver. Helen, I remember you from last night. You're the woman who retrieved my wooden horse from the waste bin. Yes, she said, letting out a small, shaky breath. I couldn't stand to see a piece of work like that thrown away like garbage. I know how much time it takes to carve something. My father was a carpenter, and he always told me that a man's labor has dignity. What Mr. Thornton did was shameful, but that isn't the only reason I'm calling you. I'm listening, Helen, I said. I have some documents, Mr. Miller, she said, her voice growing steadier as she went on. Photocopies of papers I found in Mr. Thornton's private study. I made them 6 months ago because I knew something crooked was going on, and I wanted to protect myself in case things went bad. I didn't know who to trust, but after the way they treated you last night, I knew I had to bring them to you. What kind of documents? I asked, pulling a notepad and a pencil toward me on the counter. I have the LLC amendment forms, Helen said. The ones that transfer the ownership of your woodworking business and your name to Thornton Heritage LLC. They have your signature on them, but the handwriting looks completely different from the checks I've seen you sign. I also have photocopies of the Merrick Road property transfer papers. The signature on the deed is your daughter Sarah's, but I have the original insurance forms they were paperclipped to when she signed them. I found them in the bottom drawer of Mr. Thornton's filing cabinet, with a note from his attorney explaining how to frame the documents so she wouldn't look at the deed page. My chest felt cold, but my head was perfectly clear. And you have internal correspondence? Yes, Helen said. Printed emails between Mr. Thornton and his lawyer. detailing the dates of the filing and explaining how they could use your contractor's license to secure the funding for the Brooklyn Historic Preservation contract. They've been planning this for over a year. I looked down at the blank yellow page of my notepad. The pencil in my hand was steady. Why are you doing this, Helen? You could lose your job. A job in a house like that pays well, and you've been there a long time. There was a long silence on the line. When Helen spoke again, the nervousness was gone, replaced by a quiet, flat anger that I recognized. It was the anger of someone who had been pushed past their limit. My son is a framing contractor, Helen said softly. He runs a small crew in Brooklyn. He's a hard-working boy, and he built his business from the ground up, just like you did. Last spring, Mr. Thornton met him at a site walkthrough for one of his residential buildings. My son didn't know who he was, and Mr. Thornton didn't know I was his mother. In front of 6 of my son's men, Mr. Thornton told him that men who work with their hands don't build anything worth noting. He told him they just move dirt for the people who actually design the world. She paused, taking a breath. My son came home that night and didn't say a word, but I saw the look on his face. I went to work the next day, and when I was cleaning Mr. Thornton's study, I saw the files on his desk. I made the copies that afternoon. I've been waiting for the right moment ever since. I understand, I said. Where are the documents now? I have them scanned on my computer, she said. I can send them to an email address, or I can fax them if you have a number. I don't want them in my house anymore. I looked at the piece of paper where I had written Walter's number. Walter had a fax machine in his home office in Queens, a heavy, outdated machine he refused to throw away because he believed digital files were too easy to lose. I'm going to give you a fax number, Helen, I said. It belongs to a friend of mine, Walter Higgins. He's a retired construction manager, and he's helping me with this. Can you send them now? I can send them within the hour, Helen said. Mr. Miller, please be careful. Victor Thornton is a powerful man in the city. He has a lot of connections. He built his power on wood he didn't buy and signatures he didn't own, Helen, I said quietly. In my experience, those kinds of structures don't hold up when the wind starts to blow. Thank you. After I hung up, I dialed Walter's number. It rang once before he answered, his voice alert and clear. He had already finished his coffee and was waiting by the phone. Arthur? Walter said. What's going on? Did she call you? You need to turn on your fax machine, Walter, I said. Helen is sending the files over now. We have the blueprints. The 11 days between Christmas and January 6th were the quietest I had spent in years. It wasn't the kind of quiet that brings peace, where you can sit back and let your mind rest. There is a difference between those two things. Peaceful quiet is what you feel when a project is completed and the tools are put away. This quiet was the kinds that settles over a job site before the heavy framing begins, a silence of calculation, of checking measurements twice, and of making sure every cut will be exact, because once the wood is cut, there is no going back. Helen's documents arrived that Christmas afternoon, rolling out of Walter's old fax machine in a long, steady stream of gray ink pages. There were 14 pages in total, organized neatly by date. Walter printed out clean copies of everything at the office supply store on Northern Boulevard the next mornings, and we spread them across his kitchen table in Woodside. We sat there in the pale December light, going over every page twice, the same way we used to review complex blueprints before the first nail went into a house. What Helen had sent us was devastatingly thorough. First, there was the LLC amendment form. It was a corporate filing that added Victor's shell company, Thornton Heritage LLC, as the managing partner of my business, Arthur Miller Custom Woodworking. At the bottom was my signature, written in a dark ink. But as I looked at it through Walter's magnifying glass, the forgery was obvious to anyone who knew my handwriting. The letters were too upright, too consistent, and written with a steady precision that lacked the slight leftward lean my handwriting had carried since I injured my wrist on a framing job in 1997. It was the signature of a man who had traced my name from an old invoice, not the signature of a man who had signed his name on a moving clipboard on a job site. Next was the property transfer document for the Merrick Road house. It was a deed transfer, signing over the ownership of my home and workshop to Thornton Heritage LLC for the sum of $1. Sarah's signature was at the bottom, notarized by a clerk in Victor's office. But right next to it was the photocopy of the insurance update form she thought she was signing. You could see the faint outline of a paperclip mark at the top of both pages, proving they had been clipped together to hide the deed transfer text when Victor handed her the stack of papers. But the most damning pieces of evidence were the printed emails. Between Victor and his corporate attorney, they mapped out the entire plan over a 6-month period. Victor's emails were filled with detailed calculations, showing how he could use my contractor's license and my company's 35-year portfolio of historic wood installations to win a $5 million landmark restoration contract in Brooklyn. He explained to his lawyer that my name was essential for the bank funding, and that once the contract was signed and the project funded, they could quiet file another amendment removing me from the LLC entirely. I didn't feel anger as I read those emails. I didn't feel the heat in my chest that had flared up when Victor threw my wooden horse into the fireplace bin. What I felt was a cold, sharp certainty. I spent the next week sitting at my own kitchen table on Merrick Road, writing. I didn't write letters to Sarah, and I didn't call the apartment. Instead, I used a yellow legal pad and a pencil to write a list of specifications. I wrote it the same way I had spent 40 years writing project orders. No unnecessary words, no emotional language, just clear, numbered items that detailed exactly what needed to be built and in what order. My list had 8 items. Item 1 was the business entity. I wanted a complete audit of Arthur Miller Custom Woodworking and a formal criminal complaint filed with the district attorney's office for the forged signature on the LLC registry. Item 2 was the Merrick Road property. I wanted the deed transfer declared void ab initio due to fraud in the inducement, returning the title of the house and the workshop back to my name. Item 3 was the sale of the house. I had decided I didn't want to live on Merrick Road anymore. The house was too big, too quiet, and filled with memories of a family that had quietly drifted away. I wrote down the name of a commercial broker I knew who could handle a fast, off-market sale of the property without a listing sign in the yard. Item 4 was my will. I wanted to structure my assets into a new entity, the Martha Miller Foundation, a charitable trust dedicated to supporting elderly craftsmen who didn't have family support networks. Everything I owned, including the proceeds from the house sale, would go into that trust. Item 5 was the transfer of the remaining business assets. I wanted to assign the physical workshop tools, the remaining inventory of select oak and cherry, and the custom machinery to Walter Higgins. Walter had the space in his Queens garage, and he would know how to use them. Item 6 was the submission to the New York State Education Department, Office of the Professions, the licensing board that oversaw Victor's architecture and development credentials. I wanted a formal complaint filed against his license, backed by the recording and the forged documents. Item 7 was the division of the joint bank accounts I had shared with Sarah since Martha's death, moving my liquid assets into a private account in my name only. Item 8 was a $529 college savings plan. I wanted to establish a $250,000 education trust for Grace, Victor's daughter, but I wanted Helen Jenkins, the housekeeper, named as the sole custodian of the account, structured so that Victor could never touch the money or change the beneficiary without a judge's order. By January 5th, the list was finished. I read it over 3 times, checked the spelling of the legal terms Walter had given me, and folded the yellow paper into the pocket of my navy jacket. The frame was square. The concrete was ready to be poured. On January 6th, Walter and I walked into the building on 6th Avenue, where Diana Mercer kept her law office. The lobby was a massive expanse of polished gray granite and stainless steel, with security turnstiles and a reception desk that looked like it was designed to intimidate anyone who didn't belong in Manhattan real estate. We took the elevator up to the 31st floor, the city flattening out below us through the glass windows. Diana Mercer's office was quiet. There were no piles of paper on her desk, no clutter on the shelves. Everything about the room, from the thin leather chairs to the clean wooden surface of her conference table, suggested a highly structured, uncluttered mind. Diana herself was a compact, sharp-featured woman in her early 50s, with dark hair and reading glasses that she kept pushed up on her forehead when she wasn't looking at documents. She shook my hand with a brief, firm grip that was over before I had a chance to say hello. Arthur, Diana said, gesturing to the chairs. Walter speaks very highly of you. He says you're a man who knows how to build things correctly. Sit down, please. I sat, taking the yellow legal pad from the pocket of my navy suit and placing it on the table between us. Next to it, Walter set down the thick manila envelope containing Helen's printed documents and the red plastic recorder. Diana looked at the pad, then at the envelope, and finally at me. Walk me through it. Walter gave me the outline over the phone, but I want to hear the details from you. I spent the next 15 minutes explaining everything. I started with the dinner on Christmas Eve, the isolated table near the kitchen doors, and the way Victor had thrown away the wooden horse. I explained how Grace had slipped the recorder into my pocket, and then I played the tape, letting Victor and Beatrice's hushed voices fill the clean office. Diana listened in silence, her pen poised over a legal pad, her eyes fixed on the middle distance. She didn't interrupt once. When the recording finished, she reached for the envelope, pulled out Helen's photocopies, and went through them page by page, comparing the LLC filing with the deed transfer and the emails. She spent 10 minutes reading, her fingers tracing the forged signature on the business registry. Then she took off her reading glasses, set them on the table, and looked at me. The LLC amendment is a clear case of corporate identity theft and signature forgery, Diana said. Under New York Penal Law, Section 170.25, criminal possession of a forged instrument in the second degree is a Class D felony. And because they use this forged document to secure a bank loan and commercial contract under your name, it's also a federal issue. We will document everything and submit a formal complaint directly to the Manhattan District Attorney's Office and the State Commercial Fraud Division. That will run on its own track, and once the DA gets a look at this tape and these emails, they won't have any choice but to open an indictment. And the house? I asked. The Merrick Road deed transfer is voidable, Diana said, tapping her pen against the photocopy. Your daughter Sarah signed those papers under a material misrepresentation. Victor told her she was signing insurance papers while slipping a deed transfer underneath. In New York, this is classic fraud in the inducement. We can file a civil lawsuit in Nassau County Supreme Court immediately, asking a judge to unwind that transaction and restore the title back to your name. The court will grant it once they see the emails where Victor and his attorney planned the deception. But you wrote here in your notes that you want to sell the property. Why? I don't want to live there anymore, Diana, I said. Merrick Road was a family home, but the family isn't there anymore. Martha is gone, and Sarah has made her choice. I want to clear the deck. I want to take the equity out of the house and put it where it will do some actual good, rather than letting it sit there as a target for Victor's next development scheme. Diana nodded slowly, her expression changing from professional calculation to a quiet, respectful understanding. I understand. We can handle it that way. We'll file the lawsuit to void the transfer, and simultaneously, I will contact Jim Parrish. He's a commercial broker I work with who specializes in off-market transactions. He can find a buyer who wants the property for the land or the workshop, close the deal quickly in cash, and we won't even have to put a for sale sign on the grass. Victor won't know the house is sold until the new owners show up to change the locks. That's exactly what I want, I said. Diana picked up her pen and looked at the next item on my yellow pad. Item 4. You want to redirect all your personal assets, including the proceeds from the house sale, into a charitable trust called the Martha Miller Foundation. And you want to structure your will so that nothing goes to your daughter. Are you certain about this, Arthur? In my line of work, I see a lot of families tear themselves apart over estates. If you disinherit your only child, she will almost certainly contest the will when you pass. I'm certain, I said, and she won't be able to contest it if the assets are already held in an irrevocable trust during my lifetime. The trust will own the money, not me. I want to make sure she gets the chance to figure out who she is without my money making it easy for her. That's the best thing I can give her now. Diana wrote for a moment, her pen scratching against the paper. We will draft the trust documents and the new will. It will be ironclad. Victor's lawyers won't be able to find a single crack in the structure. Diana Mercer leaned forward, her eyes moving to the next item on my yellow pad. Item 5. The transfer of the remaining assets of Arthur Miller Custom Woodworking. You want to assign the physical machinery, the inventory of select timber, and the custom tools to Walter Higgins. Arthur, this is a significant amount of specialized equipment. Some of those vintage planes and custom cabinet saws are worth thousands of dollars on the secondary market. Are you sure you want to transfer them for no financial consideration? I looked at Walter, who was sitting next to me, staring at his coffee cup. Walter has the space in his Queen's garage, and more importantly, he knows how to keep them oiled and adjusted. I've spent 40 years collecting those tools. Some of them belong to my grandfather. They aren't just inventory to be liquidated for a tax write-off. They are meant to be used by a man who respects the wood. Walter is the only person who fits that description. Walter looked up, his jaw tight, but he didn't say a word. He just gave a single, firm nod. "All right," Diana said, writing it down. "I'll draft a bill of sale transferring the corporate assets of the woodworking shop to Walter Higgins, effective January 7th. That will remove the equipment from the corporate registry before the DA's investigation locks down the company's accounts." She turned the page on her pad, her eyes narrowing as she read the next number. Item 6, the Licensing Board Complaint. Victor Thornton is a licensed architect and developer registered with the New York State Education Department Office of the Professions. Arthur, filing a complaint backed by a criminal indictment for forgery, and corporate fraud is a massive blow to an architect's career. The board is notoriously slow, but they are incredibly thorough. Once they receive the forged documents, the emails, and a copy of the criminal complaint, they will open a formal investigation. If the DA files charges, Victor's license will be suspended immediately pending the trial. He won't be able to sign off on a single blueprint or pull a single building permit in the state of New York. "That's the point," I said, my voice quiet. "Victor thinks that men who work with their hands don't build anything worth noting. He thinks his license and his fancy office make him the creator, and the rest of us are just dirt movers. I want the board to remind him that you can't design a house when your foundation is built on a forgery." Diana smiled, a thin, sharp expression that had no warmth but carried a deep professional satisfaction. "Consider it done. I'll prepare the petition for the board myself. It will be ready by the 14th. She moved her finger down the yellow page. Item 7. Moving your personal liquid assets out of the joint account you share with Sarah. We can execute that transfer immediately. The bank records show the funds are solely from your business earnings and the pension Martha left behind. Sarah has never contributed a single dollar to that account, so moving the funds to a private registry in your name is entirely legal. I'll have the transfer orders ready for your signature today." She stopped on the last item, her pen hovering over the paper. She looked at me for a long moment, her eyes searching my face. Item 8. A 529 college savings plan for Grace Thornton. Arthur, you want to deposit $250,000 into a trust for this child's education, naming Helen Jenkins as the sole custodian. Grace is Victor's daughter from his first marriage. She is not your biological grandchild. She shares no blood with you, and after we execute this plan, her father's family will almost certainly sever all ties with you. Why are you doing this? I reached into my pocket and touched the small red recorder. I thought about a little girl in a green velvet dress, sitting beside me behind a folding screen, telling me the party sounded less happy than she thought it would. I thought about her, holding the little red device with both hands, recording the fireplace and the soup boil, saving the small, quiet moments of a house that had no other warmth in it. She was the only person in that entire house who treated me like I belonged there, I told Diana. She sat next to me when the hosts put me in the kitchen corridor. She told me she missed Martha and she trusted me enough to slip her favorite toy into my pocket to keep it safe. In my life, Diana, I've learned that you don't judge a family by the blood. You judge them by what they leave in the room. Grace left a lot of room for me. That counts for something. Diana's pen scratched against the paper, her movements slower now, more deliberate. And the custodian, Helen Jenkins? Helen Jenkins saved the wooden horse from the trash because her father was a carpenter and she understood the dignity of labor, I said. And she risked her livelihood to copy those files because she couldn't stand to see a working man humiliated. She is the only person in that house who has the moral authority to manage that child's future. I want her to have the keys to that account. And I want it structured so that Victor could never touch a single dollar of it to pay off his developers or his lawyers. Diana set her pen down and aligned it perfectly with the edge of her pad. I will structure the 529 plan with a court-appointed custodianship. Helen will be the trustee, and any change to the beneficiary or the withdrawal rules will require a signed order from a Nassau County surrogate judge. It will be completely out of Victor's reach. She reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a small sealed white envelope I had given her when we first sat down. It had Sarah's name written on the front in my handwriting. "And this?" Diana asked, holding the envelope. "The letter for your daughter. Keep it in your safe," I said. "Don't open it, and don't send it until the sale of the Merrick Roadhouse is finalized and the DA files the indictment. Sarah needs to read it when the dust settles, not before." Diana nodded, placing the envelope inside a metal lockbox in her drawer. "I understand, Arthur. We have our blueprints. I'll have the trust agreements and the will drafted by the 10th. We'll notarize and file everything on the 14th. I stood up, buttoning the front button of my navy suit. "Thank you, Diana. Don't thank me yet, Arthur," she said, standing to shake my hand. "We haven't started digging the foundation yet." The following 8 days were filled with the quiet coordination of a project coming together behind the scenes. While the winter winds rattled the windows of my house on Merrick Road, I went about my work with a quiet focus. I sorted through the blueprints, the bank statements, and the personal files in my desk, organizing everything into neat folders. I walked through the house, touching the oak handrails I had built in 1989 and the kitchen cabinets Martha and I had designed together. Every room had a story, a physical reminder of a life we had spent decades building. I stood in the doorway of Sarah's old bedroom, looking at the empty walls where her high school posters once hung. I didn't reach out to Sarah, and she didn't call me. The silence between us sat like a heavy, cold wall, but I didn't try to break it. I had spent 3 years trying to hold that wall up, and I was finally ready to let it go. On January 10th, Diana Mercer emailed the drafted legal documents to Walter. We spent that evening reviewing them at his kitchen table in Woodside, checking every line, every legal definition, and every signature block to ensure there were no cracks in the framing. Diana's work was pristine, and we didn't find a single misplaced comma. It was a solid plan, well drafted and ready for implementation. By January 14th, the frame was ready. Walter and I drove back into Manhattan, the snow from a fresh winter storm piled high along the sides of the streets. We sat in Diana's conference room, a notary public standing by the desk with a heavy stamp in his hand. One by one, I signed the documents. I signed the Martha Miller Foundation Trust Agreement, establishing the irrevocable trust that would hold my life savings and the proceeds of the house sale. I signed the new pour-over will, directing any remaining personal assets into that trust upon my death. I signed the bill of sale that officially transferred the ownership of the physical woodworking machinery, the custom table saws, and the select oak inventory to Walter. Finally, I signed the authorization forms for the Nassau County lawsuit. "Jim Parrish came through," Diana said, setting a fresh folder on the table after the notary had stamped the last page. "He has a cash buyer for the Merrick Road property. It's a local historical society and custom wood restoration company. They restore old timber frame barns and historic landmarks across Long Island. They've been looking for a permanent workshop on Long Island for 2 years, and they want to keep the building exactly as it is, including your old workshop and all the custom work you did in the main house. They're offering $850,000 cash deal with a 30-day close and no contingencies. They've already signed the contract and deposited the 10% escrow. That's a good price," I said, "and I'm glad they want to keep the workshop. Martha always liked the garden behind it. She'd be glad to know someone is still making sawdust there. We can execute the contract today," Diana said, sliding the sales agreement across the table. "But because the deed is currently registered in the name of Thornton Heritage LLC, we have to file the lawsuit first. The moment we file the civil complaint in Nassau County Supreme Court, I will record a lis pendens, a notice of pendency, against the property index." "What does the lis pendens do?" Walter asked, leaning in. A lis pendens is a formal notice to the public that the title of the property is subject to active litigation, Diana explained, her voice carrying the calm satisfaction of a builder explaining a perfect joint. Under New York Civil Practice Law and Rules, Section 6501, once a lis pendens is filed, the property cannot be sold, transferred, or used as collateral for a loan. It clouds the title completely. If a bank or a title insurance company searches the registry, the lis pendens pops up immediately and they will freeze any financial transaction associated with that property. She looked at me, a sharp glint in her eyes. Victor Thornton is currently trying to close on a $2 million commercial construction loan for his landmark restoration project in Brooklyn. He is using the Merrick Road property as his primary collateral to secure the financing. The bank was scheduled to execute the loan agreement this week. The moment I file this lawsuit and record the lis pendens, the bank's title insurance company will halt the transaction. Victor won't get a single dollar of that loan. His shell company's collateral will be locked down in court, and his project funding will vanish overnight. He won't be able to pay his subcontractors, Walter said, a quiet grin appearing on his broad face. Or his lawyers. Exactly, Diana said. And because the complaint alleges fraud in the inducement and signature forgery, the bank will immediately launch an internal review of the LLC amendment Victor filed. They will realize he used a forged business registration to secure their commercial line of credit. The bank's legal department will refer the case to the DA's commercial fraud unit before we even file our own criminal complaint. Victor's world is going to become very crowded, very fast. I took the pen from the table and signed the sales contract for the Historical Society. We're not just clouding the title, Diana. We're cutting the load-bearing supports. We are, she agreed, taking the signed contract and placing it in her folder. I'll file the lawsuit and the lis pendens in Mineola this afternoon. The bank will receive the title notice by tomorrow morning. Jim Parrish's escrow team is already standing by. We close on the sale on February 14th. I looked out the window at the gray sky over Manhattan. The snow was coming down in thick, heavy sheets now, blanketing the city in a cold, quiet white. Let's go home, Walter, I said. We've done the layout. Now we wait for the concrete to cure. On January 15th, Diana Mercer filed the lawsuit in Nassau County Supreme Court, and by 4 that afternoon, the lis pendens was officially recorded against the deed of the Merrick Road property. The reaction was almost immediate. The next morning, I woke up early, around 6, and went down to the kitchen to make a pot of tea. I sat by the window, watching the morning light slowly paint the snow-covered yard in shades of blue and gray. My cell phone, which had been silent for weeks, began to buzz on the kitchen counter. The first 3 calls came from Victor's office number. I didn't answer them. I just sat at the table drinking my tea and watched the screen light up and fade back to black. 10 minutes later, the phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed Sarah's name. I let it ring for 3 cycles before I finally slid the screen to answer and placed the phone to my ear. Dad, Sarah's voice came through the speaker, loud, sharp, and thick with a panicked anger. Dad, what on earth did you do? Victor is at his office, and he's completely losing his mind. His bank just froze the commercial construction loan for the landmark project in Brooklyn. They told his lawyer that there's a title lien against our collateral. They're saying your house on Merrick Road is locked in litigation. The house is in my name, Sarah, I said, keeping my voice quiet and steady. And it always has been. Victor tried to take it, but the law doesn't allow for that kind of theft. He didn't steal it, she yelled, her voice cracking under the stress. It was a business arrangement. Victor was using the equity to secure the funding for a project that would make millions for this family. He was trying to build a future for us. And you walked into court and filed a lawsuit against his company? You're ruining our lives, Dad. If this loan doesn't clear by the end of the week, Victor's firm will go default on the interest payments. The construction crews in Brooklyn are already threatening to walk off the job because he can't pay the payroll. If Victor's firm collapses, Sarah, it isn't because of my lawsuit, I told her. It's because he built his entire business on a lie. He forged my signature on the corporate registry to steal my company's name and my contractor's license. That's a felony in the state of New York, and he lied to you paperclipping a deed transfer to the bottom of medical insurance forms to steal my home. Did he tell you about that part of the business arrangement? There was a sudden, sharp silence on the other end of the line. I could hear Sarah's rapid, uneven breathing through the phone. For a second, I thought she was going to ask questions, to demand the truth, or to ask how I found out. But when she spoke again, her voice was cold, hard, and defensive. "Victor did what he had to do to manage the paperwork, Dad," she said, her voice dropping into a flat, defiant tone. "That's how business is done in the city. You don't understand that world. You're just an old carpenter who lives in the past. Victor is trying to build something real, and you're trying to destroy it because your pride was hurt on Christmas Eve." "My pride has nothing to do with it, Sarah," I said. "Victor committed fraud. The documents are already in the hands of the district attorney's office. The concrete has been poured, and there's no way to undo the structure now." "You have to drop the lawsuit, Dad," she demanded, her voice rising again. "You call your lawyer today and tell her to withdraw the complaint and release the lis pendens." "Victor is already drafting a settlement agreement. He will pay you back the equity once the Brooklyn project is completed. You just need to sign the release forms. If you don't do this, Dad, if you ruin my marriage and my life, I swear to you, you will never see Grace again. I will make sure you are completely dead to this family. You will spend the rest of your life alone on Merrick Road, and no one will even show up for your funeral." I closed my eyes. The threat didn't hurt the way it would have a month ago. The words were heavy, designed to wound, but they had no weight because I had already spent 3 years feeling the coldness of the wall she had built between us. "Grace is Victor's daughter, Sarah," I said quietly. "But she was the only person in that house who treated me like a human being on Christmas Eve. You sat at the main table and watched your husband throw my gift in the trash and discard your mother's photograph. And you didn't say a single word. You chose his world over mine. And now you have to live with the consequences of that choice. Dad, please." "The lawsuit stays, Sarah," I said. "And the Merrick Roadhouse is already under contract. I sold it to a historical restoration society yesterday. They close in 30 days. I'm moving out of New York next month." Sarah let out a sharp, choked gasp. "You sold the house? You sold Mom's house?" "I sold my house," I corrected her. "Your mother's memory isn't in those walls, Sarah. She left it in the way she lived and the way she loved. You forgot that. I haven't." Before she could answer, I pressed the end button. I set the cell phone back on the counter, its screen blinking once before going dark. I stood in the quiet kitchen, the phone still in my hand, and listened to the silence of the house. It was a clean silence, empty of the expectations and the pretenses that had filled my life for the past 3 years. I walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the backyard. The snow had stopped, and the afternoon sun was reflecting off the white ground, bright, cold, and clear. For the first time in years, I felt like I was standing on a solid foundation. Over the next 2 weeks, the slow, heavy gears of the legal system began to turn, grinding down the structure Victor Thornton had built on a foundation of lies. The first sign of the collapse came from the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. Diana Mercer had submitted our file, containing the audio recording of the conversation between Victor and Beatrice, Helen's photocopies of the forged LLC registry amendments, and bank statements showing how my contractor's license had been used, directly to the head of the commercial fraud unit. The DA's investigators didn't take long to realize they had a solid case. A signature forgery on a registered corporate amendment used to secure a $2 million commercial credit line under false pretenses was a major offense. By the end of January, the DA had opened a formal criminal investigation, and subpoena orders were issued to Victor's firm and his bank. Victor's bank, realizing they had been presented with forged documents, immediately suspended the corporate credit line for Thornton Heritage LLC. They didn't wait for a trial. The bank's legal department conducted an internal review and referred the matter to the State Commercial Fraud Division. Without the $2 million loan, Victor's landmark restoration project in Brooklyn ground to a halt. The subcontractors, who hadn't been paid for their January work and were tired of his empty promises, pulled their men off the site. The scaffolding sat empty, and the historic brick structure was left half-framed and exposed to the freezing rain and winter storms. The investors who had backed Victor began to panic, demanding audits and threatening their own lawsuits. At the same time, the New York State Education Department, Office of the Professions, received Diana's complaint against Victor's professional architecture license. The board opened an investigation, citing the criminal allegations of signature forgery and commercial fraud. Victor's lawyers scrambled to respond, but their letters had no effect. The licensing board was unhurried, but their rules were clear. Any architect facing felony charges related to their professional practice would have their license suspended pending the resolution of the case. Victor could no longer sign off on plans or secure building permits. While Victor's world was collapsing, I spent my days in the workshop behind the Merrick Roadhouse, packing. Walter Higgins came over every afternoon to help me, bringing his toolboxes and his steady, quiet presence. We spent our time going through the tools I had collected over 40 years of cabinet making and custom building. It was slow work, but it gave us a chance to talk about the old days, the jobs we had built in the 80s and 90s, and the way the trade had changed. Some of the tools were heavy, modern machinery, large cabinet saws, professional planers, and heavy-duty dust collectors. Others were small, hand-worn tools, vintage block planes, hand-forged chisels, and custom templates I had carved myself to match the crown molding of historic homes. We loaded the heavy machinery onto Walter's flatbed truck, using a chain hoist to lift the cast iron bases. We wrapped the smaller tools in heavy canvas rolls and packed them into wooden crates I had built from scrap pine. "This planer still runs like a top, Arthur," Walter said one afternoon, wiping a thin layer of grease off the cast iron bed of the heavy machine. "You sure you don't want to keep it? You could set up a small shop down south." "I'm sure, Walter," I said, wrapping a set of carbon steel chisels in oil-soaked felt. "I'm not going to be building kitchens where I'm going. The tools are yours now. They belong in a shop where someone knows how to use them, not sitting in a storage unit gathering rust. You've earned them." Walter didn't argue. He just took the canvas roll of chisels and placed it carefully in a wooden crate, his large hands moving with the quiet respect of a man who understood what those tools represented. They weren't just metal and wood. They were 40 years of my life. 40 years of honest labor and quiet pride, transferred to the only friend who had stood by me when the foundation failed. By the first week of February, the workshop was empty. The walls, which had been covered in hanging saws, templates, and jars of old screws for 22 years, were bare. The concrete floor was clean, swept free of the oak and cherry sawdust that had covered it for decades. The empty space felt large and quiet, but it didn't feel lonely. It felt like a job site after the cleanup is done, ready for the next crew to move in. Victor tried to find me during those weeks. He sent 2 of his associates to Merrick Road, and he even drove out himself one evening, his luxury sedan idling at the curb for 20 minutes while he stared at the house. But I didn't go to the door, and I didn't answer the phone. I had already moved my liquid assets out of the joint bank account, leaving only a few $100s in the account Sarah and I had shared. Diana Mercer called me on February 5th to confirm the details of the closing. "The Historical Society's title company has approved the transaction," Diana said. "Because the lis pendens is active, the court has ordered the escrow funds to be held in a secure trust account managed by my firm. The moment the sale closes, the title will transfer to the Historical Society, and the proceeds will be deposited directly into the Martha Miller Foundation Trust. Victor won't be able to touch a single cent of the money, and the house will be completely out of his reach." "We close on the 14th, I said. "Valentine's Day. Martha would have liked the timing." "She would," Diana agreed. "I'll have the final papers ready for your signature in Mineola. Are you ready to leave, Arthur?" I looked at the empty shelves of the kitchen, the boxes piled by the door, and the clean wood table where Martha and I had sat for 30 years. "I've been ready for a long time, Diana," I said. On February 14th, Valentine's Day, the closing was finalized at Diana Mercer's office in Mineola. The representatives from the Historical Society signed the transfer documents, and their bank executed the wire transfer. The sale of the Merrick Road property was complete. The house where I had lived for 22 years, where Sarah had grown up, and where Martha had spent her final days now belonged to a group of people who wanted to preserve it for its historical value. It was a bittersweet feeling, leaving behind the rooms where we had laughed, cried, and shared our lives. I thought about the workshop where I spent thousands of hours, and the garden where Martha planted her hydrangeas every spring. But I knew that those memories belonged to me, not to the physical lumber of the house. The $850, zero in cash proceeds, was deposited directly into the Martha Miller Foundation Trust, completely out of reach of Victor's creditors or his shell companies. Deanna Mercer handed me a copy of the wire transfer confirmation, along with the notarized trust agreements. Her assistant stood by the door, holding a thick folder of files. "It's official, Arthur," Diana said, her voice quiet but firm. "The title has transferred. The money is in the trust, and the first scholarship disbursements for retired woodworkers will begin next month." More importantly, the Manhattan District Attorney's Office has officially filed charges against Victor Thornton. They've issued an arrest warrant for second-degree forgery and grand larceny. The state police served the warrant at his office 2 hours ago. I looked at the wire transfer paper in my hand. The numbers were written in black ink, digits on a page. 850,000. It was a significant amount of money, the physical representation of decades of hard work and careful saving. But it didn't feel like money anymore. It felt like a boundary, a solid, load-bearing wall that Victor could never climb over. "And the letter for Sarah?" I asked. "I sent it by courier to her apartment this morning," Diana said. "It should be in her hands by now. She will read it while the news of Victor's arrest is breaking. She has the truth now, Arthur. Whether she chooses to believe it is up to her." "Thank you, Diana," I said. I stood up, adjusting the collar of my navy suit. "For everything." "You did the layout, Arthur," she said, giving me a rare, genuine smile. "I just helped you drive the nails. Take care of yourself down south." I walked out of the office and drove to JFK Airport. Walter Higgins was waiting for me at the departure terminal, his big flatbed truck idling by the curb. He had driven my last 2 suitcases in his truck, and he stood on the sidewalk with his hands in his coat pockets, his collar turned up against the cold winter wind. "The tools are already set up in my garage, Arthur," Walter said as he handed me my suitcases. "I spent yesterday aligning the bed of the planer. It runs like a watch. I'm glad, Walter," I said. I shook his hand, his large, rough palm holding mine with a strength that had stood the test of 38 years. "Thank you for standing by me." "There wasn't any other choice, Arthur," Walter said. "You don't let a good man's house fall down when you know how to build a frame." "Call me when you get to Key West." "I will," I said. I walked into the terminal, checked my bags, and went through security. I was carrying only a small shoulder bag containing my personal papers, Martha's watercolor painting of the backyard, and the red, plastic recorder Grace had given me. At 3:15 in the afternoon, my flight took off. I sat by the window, watching the snow-covered streets of Long Island shrink below us as the plane climbed into the winter clouds. The highways looked like thin gray ribbons, and the houses were tiny white squares. I thought about all the roofs I had shingled, and all the doors I had hung down there. That city had held my entire life for 59 years. I watched it disappear into the gray fog, and for the first time, I didn't feel any regret. I was leaving the cold behind. 3 hours later, the plane began its descent. The gray clouds of New York were gone, replaced by a wide open sky of deep indigo and gold. As the plane banked over the water, I could see the string of islands that made up the Florida Keys, the green highlights of the mangroves, and the clear blue water of the Gulf of Mexico reflecting the last rays of the sun. The air that hit me when I stepped off the plane at Key West was warm, humid, and smelled of salt and tropical flowers. It was the first time in 3 years that I had taken a breath that didn't feel cold. I got into a taxi and gave the driver the address of the small marina where I had rented a slip. The town was alive with the sound of music, people walking in light clothing, and the quiet rustle of palm trees in the warm evening breeze. I paid the driver, picked up my bags, and walked down the wooden dock of the marina. My boat, a restored 1962 Chesapeake sloop I had bought sight unseen through Jim Parrish's connections, was tied to the slip at the end of the dock. The hull was white, the teak trim weathered but solid, and the name the transom was carved in clean, deep letters. I stepped aboard, set my bags in the cabin, and stood on the deck, looking out at the harbor. The sun had set, leaving a long line of orange and violet light along the horizon. I stood there for a long time, the warm water lapping against the hull, and I knew that the third option had been the right one. I had walked away from a house that didn't want me, but I had built something that would stand. By the end of February, the warm sun of Key West had started to thaw the chill that had settled in my bones over the past 3 years. I spent my mornings on the Martha working on the teak deck, scraping away the old peeling varnish and applying fresh, clean coats that smelled of pine and linseed oil. It was slow, rhythmic work, the kind of physical labor that allows your mind to settle and your thoughts to clear. On February 28th, my phone rang. It was Diana Mercer calling from her office in Manhattan. "Arthur," Diana said, her voice carrying the crisp, businesslike tone I had come to appreciate. "I'm calling to give you an update on the situation in New York. The dust is starting to settle, and the framework we put in place is holding up exactly as expected." I'm listening, Diana," I said, setting my varnish brush down on a clean rag. "The Manhattan DA's office has formally indicted Victor Thornton on 3 counts of grand larceny, 2 counts of signature forgery, and 1 count of commercial fraud," she explained. "The judge set a significant bail amount, but Victor hasn't been able to post it. The bank froze all his corporate accounts, and his personal assets are locked up in the LLC audit. His mother, Beatrice, tried to use the family's real estate holdings to secure a bail bond, but the bank's title insurance companies refused to execute the agreements because of the criminal investigation. Victor is currently sitting in a cell at Rikers Island, waiting for his arraignment." I looked out at the harbor, where a couple of white sailboats were slowly heading out towards the open water. The water was a brilliant, deep blue, reflecting the clear afternoon sky. "And Sarah?" I asked. "Sarah received your letter on the 14th, Diana said, her tone softening slightly. "She read it while Victor was being processed by the police. According to my contacts, she had a major confrontation with Beatrice at the apartment that afternoon. She finally realized that Victor had forged your signature on the LLC registry and tricked her into signing the deed transfer. She packed her bags and Grace's things and moved out of the Upper East Side apartment the next morning." "Where is she now?" I asked. "She rented a small 2-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn near her old school friends," Diana said. "She hired a very sharp divorce attorney on the 20th. She is filing for divorce, citing the fraud and the criminal indictment. She has also refused to sign any joint defense agreements or release forms for Victor's lawyers. She is cooperating fully with the DA's office, confirming that she was presented with the deed transfer under the pretense of insurance updates." I let out a slow breath, my hand resting on the smooth teak rail of the Martha. The letter I had written to Sarah was short. I hadn't filled it with anger or accusations. I had simply written the truth. I reminded her of the kitchen table on Merrick Road and how her mother had spent years making sure she had everything she needed to build a good life. I wrote about the late nights Martha and I had spent calculating our budget just to make sure she could go to a good college, and how we never once asked her for an apology when she made mistakes. I wrote, "I did not build a home to be a target for Victor's greed, Sarah, and I did not raise a daughter to be an accomplice in my own destruction. You have 2 choices now, but they aren't the ones you gave me at Penn Station. You can either spend the rest of your life defending a man who built his wealth on a forgery, or you can stand on your own 2 feet and figure out who you are without his credit cards. If you choose the second option, you will have to build a new life from the foundation up. It will be hard, but it will be yours. Start with a solid frame." It seemed she had finally chosen the third option, too. "She is cooperating with the licensing board as well," Diana continued. "Her attorney submitted a sworn affidavit confirming the signature forgery. The board has officially suspended Victor's architecture license. He can't sign off on any commercial blueprints, and the landmark project in Brooklyn has been permanently canceled by the Historic Preservation Committee. The investors are already suing him for breach of contract and recovery of their initial capital." "And Helen Jenkins?" I asked. "Helen is doing well," Diana said. "She resigned from the Thornton house last week. She didn't want to be there when the bank began the foreclosure process on the Upper East Side building. I've set up the custodianship accounts for Grace's college savings plan. The first deposit of $250,000 has been cleared by the Nassau County Surrogate Court. Helen is the sole custodian of record. She's already planning Grace's school transfers for next fall. I'm glad, I said. Helen is a good woman. She deserves a clean slate as much as anyone. We close the final estate accounting next week, Arthur, Diana said. The Martha Miller Foundation is fully funded. The first vocational scholarships for young carpentry apprentices in Queens and Long Island will be announced in April. You've built something that will last, Arthur. Thank you, Diana, I said, for making sure the blueprints were followed. It was a pleasure, Arthur, she said. Take care of yourself. I hung up the phone and sat on the deck of the Martha for a long time. The warm air of the Gulf was soft on my face, and the sound of the water lapping against the hull was a steady, quiet rhythm. I picked up my varnish brush, dipped it into the clear amber liquid, and went back to work. The wood was clean, the grain showing bright under the Florida sun. By the time May arrived, the Florida heat had settled over Key West, turning the evenings into a warm, slow expanse of sea breezes and golden sunsets. I had settled into a new routine. I didn't spend my days sitting in a chair, watching the tide go in and out. A man who has spent 40 years working with his hands doesn't know how to be idle. His hands require the texture of material, the calculation of angles, and the satisfaction of a task completed. I took a small job at the marina, helping the owner restore vintage wooden boats. It wasn't about the money. The trust fund Diana had set up provided more than enough for my simple needs. It was about the work. I spent my afternoons in a shaded shed by the water, replacing rotted mahogany ribs on old sloops and sanding down old teak trim until it was ready for fresh varnish. The local boat owners quickly learned that there was a retired carpenter from Long Island who could fit a joint with the precision of a jeweler, and my workbench was always crowded with projects. On a Tuesday evening, after the sun had dipped below the horizon and the harbor lights were beginning to flicker on, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Walter's number. Walter, I said, leaning back against the transom of the Martha. How's the weather up in Queens? Rainy and gray, as usual. Walter's voice came through, loud and familiar. I'm sitting in my garage, Arthur. I just finished building an oak library table for my daughter, using your old cabinet saw. That machine runs so smooth you can balance a dime on the cast iron table while it's cutting. I wanted to call and thank you again. It feels good to have those tools in a shop where they're being used. They're where they belong, Walter, I said, a quiet warmth moving through my chest. How are things in the old neighborhood? The Historical Society finished their work on the Merrick Roadhouse last week, Walter said, his voice dropping into a quieter, respectful tone. They opened it to the public on Saturday. They turned the main floor into a small heritage museum for Long Island craft history, and they kept the workshop exactly as you left it. They even put a brass plaque on the workshop door. It says, Arthur Miller Custom Woodworking Workshop, dedicated to the dignity of craftsmanship. I went out there to see it, Arthur. The garden Martha planted looks beautiful. They've hired a local gardener to keep it up. I looked out at the dark water of the marina, where the reflections of the masts were swaying slowly in the tide. That's good, Walter. Martha would have liked the garden. She always said the hydrangeas needed more acidic soil, but they somehow always bloomed anyway. They're blooming now, Walter said. Big blue ones, but that's not the only reason I called. I ran into Jim Parrish at the deli on Northern Boulevard yesterday. He told me the bank has officially finalized the foreclosure on Victor's property holdings. The Upper East Side apartment building is going to auction next month. Victor's firm filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy last week. The creditors are lining up, but there's nothing left for them to take. The shell companies are empty, and the landmark project in Brooklyn is a dead site. And Victor? I asked. His attorneys tried to negotiate a plea deal with the DA's commercial unit, Walter said. They wanted to reduce the charges to a misdemeanor, fraud, and probation, but the DA refused. With the recording and Helen's documents, they have an ironclad case. The trial is scheduled for September, and the lawyers are saying Victor is looking at 3 to 5 years in a state penitentiary. Beatrice tried to hire a new legal team, but she had to sell her house in Connecticut just to pay the retainer. The Thornton name doesn't carry much weight in the courts anymore. I sat in the quiet of the boat, listening to the soft, rhythmic sound of the harbor water against the hull. The news of Victor's downfall didn't bring me a sense of triumph. It didn't make me feel vindicated. It just felt like the natural resolution of a structure that had been built without proper support. If you use cheap materials and ignore the blueprints, the roof will eventually cave in. Victor had built his life on lies and theft, and the collapse was simply the law of gravity working itself out. "And Sarah?" I asked quietly. "Jim says the divorce papers were served to Victor at Rikers Island 2 weeks ago," Walter said. "She's not asking for anything from the Thornton estate. She knows there's nothing left anyway. She's working as an administrative assistant at a medical office in Brooklyn. And she's living in a small apartment. Helen Jenkins goes over twice a week to watch Grace after school. Helen says Sarah looks tired, but she's working hard. She's standing on her own feet, Arthur." "That's a start," I said. "A foundation is always the hardest part to pour. It's dirty work, and it takes time to cure. But once it's set, you can build anything on top of it." "She asked about you," Walter said. "She asked if I had heard from you. I told her you were down in Key West working on a boat. I didn't answer." I looked down at the teak deck of the Martha, the wood dark and rich under the fresh varnish. "You're a good friend, Walter," I said after a moment. "Thank you. Call me when you're ready to put her in the water, Arthur." Walter said, "I'll fly down and help you set the mast." "I'll do that," I said. "Good night, Walter." I hung up the phone and stood on the bow of the Martha looking up at the sky. The stars were bright and clear over the Keys, empty of the gray smog of the city. I breathed in the warm, salt-scented air, and I knew that the foundation had cured. By the middle of August, the restoration of the Martha was nearly complete. The hull had been painted a clean, bright white, the teak deck was smooth and rich under its protective layers of oil, and the copper fittings gleamed in the warm sunshine. I spent my days tuning the rigging and inspecting the sails, my fingers working with the patient precision that only decades of practice can bring. One afternoon, as I was sitting on the bow deck of the Martha splicing a line, the marina manager walked down the dock and handed me a small stack of mail. I wiped my hands on my jeans and thanked him. Most of it was bank statements and foundation newsletters from New York, but at the bottom of the pile was a white envelope, postmarked from Brooklyn. The address was written in a familiar, neat handwriting that I hadn't seen in months. It was a letter from Sarah. I sat down on the transom of the boat, the warm wood solid beneath me, and held the envelope in my hands for a long time, staring at the stamp. The salt breeze swirled around the harbor, carrying the scent of fuel and seaweed, but the envelope in my hand carried only the quiet weight of the past. My rough fingers were slightly shaking as I carefully tore open the paper and pulled out the single sheet of white paper. "Dear Dad," the letter began. "I'm writing this because I don't know if you'll answer my calls, and to be honest, I wouldn't blame you if you didn't. I've spent the last 6 months trying to write this letter, tearing up dozens of pages because the words never felt right. But I realize that there are no fancy words that can fix what happened. I just need to say the truth. I am so sorry, Dad. I am sorry for what I said to you at Penn Station, and I am sorry for the way I let you be treated in my home. When Victor threw your gift into the trash and took Mom's photograph, I sat there and said nothing. I convinced myself that I was protecting my life, my marriage, and my security. But the truth is, I was just a coward. I was so terrified of returning to the financial struggles of my childhood, of worrying about the utility bills and the mortgage the way you and Mom did, that I let myself believe Victor's world was the only one that mattered. I let myself become an accomplice to his greed because I wanted the comfort his money bought. Asterisk, when I read your letter on the day Victor was arrested, it felt like a roof caving in. I looked at the copies of the forged documents, and I realized that the man I had married had built his entire career on a forgery of your name and the theft of your business. He didn't just take your contractor's license, he tried to take your dignity, and I let him do it because I was too busy looking at his credit cards. I've moved out of the apartment. I rented a small place in Brooklyn. It's drafty. The radiator clanks all night, and I spent last weekend scrubbing the bathroom tiles on my hands and knees. It's a hard life, Dad, and I'm tired every single day. But for the first time in 3 years, I can look at myself in the mirror and know that the apartment belongs to me paid for with money I earned honestly at my job at the medical office. Victor's lawyers have tried to get me to sign affidavits, but I refused. I've testified to the DA's investigators, confirming that Victor presented the deed transfer papers under the pretense of insurance forms. The divorce will be finalized next month, and Victor is scheduled to go to trial in September. His lawyers are saying he will plead guilty to second-degree forgery and corporate fraud to avoid the grand larceny charges. He is looking at 3 years in prison. Beatrice has sold the Upper East Side building to pay off his debts, and she's moved back to Connecticut. Helen Jenkins has been a lifesaver. She watches Grace for me after school when I have to work late. Grace is doing well in her new school. She still has the wooden horse you carved for her, Dad. She keeps it on her nightstand next to her bed, and she tells everyone who visits that her grandpa Arthur built it with his own hands. She misses you. And she still talks about the recording she made of the party. Asterisk. I don't expect you to forgive me, Dad. I said horrible things to you, and I threw away our family for a world that was built on a lie. But I wanted you to know that I am trying to build a new life from the foundation up, just like you said in your letter. I'm trying to make the frame square this time. With love. I folded the letter, placed it back in the envelope, and set it on the deck beside me. I looked out at the harbor, where the afternoon sun was turning the water into a sheet of gold. I didn't feel anger as I read her words, and I didn't feel the cold bitterness that had filled my chest at Penn Station. What I felt was a quiet, complex sadness, but underneath it, a small trace of warmth, the feeling of a structure that had been badly damaged by a storm, but whose main supports were still standing, ready to be rebuilt. I stood up, walked down into the cabin of the boat, and placed the envelope in the wooden box where I kept Martha's watercolor painting and the red plastic recorder. "She's working on the frame, Martha," I said quietly to the empty cabin. "We'll see if she can get it plumb and true." On September 10th, the tropical summer heat of Key West began to give way to the first subtle shifts of early autumn, the warm breezes carrying a slightly drier, cleaner scent from the Gulf. I was sitting in the cabin of the Martha, working on a small piece of cherry wood, carving a new wooden handle for the companionway hatch. The shavings fell onto the floorboards, curling and smelling of sweet wood. It was quiet in the cabin, with only the gentle sound of the tide rocking the hull. My cell phone rang, its chime sounding clear in the quiet wooden interior of the boat. It was Diana Mercer. "Arthur," Diana said as soon as I answered. "I'm calling from the courthouse in Manhattan. The plea hearing has just concluded. Victor Thornton has officially entered a guilty plea to 1 count of second-degree forgery and 1 count of corporate identity theft." "What is the sentence, Diana?" I asked, setting my carving knife down on the workbench. The judge accepted the plea agreement. She explained, "Victor has been sentenced to 3 years in state prison to be served at the Fishkill Correctional Facility upstate. His professional architecture license has been permanently revoked by the New York State Board of Regents. He will never sign a blueprint or design a building in this state again. The bankruptcy court has also finalized the liquidation of his firm. Every corporate asset, from the computers to the company cars, has been auctioned off to pay the back taxes and the subcontractors' outstanding wages. The Thornton firm is completely gone." I looked down at the cherry wood block in my hand. The surface was half-carved, the raw, rough fibers showing the texture of the growth rings. "And Beatrice?" I asked. "She has moved into a small, rented condominium in Stamford, Connecticut," Diana said. "She's living on her Social Security and what little remains of her personal savings after paying off Victor's defense attorneys. The Upper East Side building has been sold, and the proceeds were entirely consumed by the bank's foreclosure judgments. The Thornton family fortune has vanished." She paused for a moment, the sound of papers rustling through the phone line. "Sarah's divorce is also official as of this morning, Arthur. The judge signed the decree. She's resumed using her maiden name, Sarah Miller. She and Grace are officially independent." "Thank you, Diana," I said, "for keeping track of the framing." "It's over, Arthur," she said, her voice carrying a rare, quiet warmth. "The legal work is done, the boundaries are set, and they are solid. You don't have to look back anymore." "I'm not looking back, Diana," I told her. "I'm looking at the chart." "Thank you." After I hung up, I sat at the wooden table in the cabin for a long time. The news of Victor's sentence and the collapse of the Thornton family didn't bring me any pleasure. It was simply the natural conclusion of a building that had been constructed with rotten lumber on a shifting bank of sand. When the storm comes, the house falls. It's a simple law of nature. I reached into the wooden box on the shelf and pulled out the envelope Sarah had sent me from Brooklyn. I unfolded her letter and read it one more time, my eyes moving over the neat, familiar lines. I took out a pad of lined yellow paper and a pen. I hadn't written a letter in years, my hand more accustomed to holding a block plane or a framing hammer than a ballpoint pen. But the words came easily, the clean structure of the thoughts falling into place like joists on a sill plate. Dear Sarah, I wrote, I received your letter. I'm glad you and Grace are settled into your apartment. A drafty radiator and dirty tiles are hard to deal with, but they are yours. Honest labor has a way of cleaning out the dust that gathers in a house when you aren't looking. Asterisk. I'm glad you're working with the DA and that you've finished the divorce. You've cleared away the debris from the collapse, and that's the first step in any rebuild. Don't worry about the past, and don't worry about my funeral. I'm not planning on dying anytime soon. The boat is ready, the mast is set, the rigging is tuned, and the sails are bent. I've named her the Martha, and she runs true. I'm leaving Key West next week, sailing north along the coast before the autumn storms start to pick up. I've checked the charts, Sarah. I'm planning on making a stop in New York. I'll tie up at the marina in Sheepshead Bay, Brooklyn, around the end of the month. I want to see you, and I want to see Grace. I have her red plastic recorder in my box, and I think it's time I gave it back to her. Let me know if you're free for dinner. We can sit at a table that doesn't belong to Victor, and we can talk about how to build a proper frame. With love, Dad. I folded the letter, placed it in a clean envelope, and sealed it. I wrote Sarah's Brooklyn address on the front in my steady, block handwriting. I held the letter for a moment, feeling the paper between my rough fingers. It felt like a message in a bottle sent across a wide ocean, but I knew it would find its way. I walked down the wooden dock to the post office at the marina entrance and dropped the letter into the mail slot. The warm, late summer air was soft on my face, and the sun was setting over the Gulf, casting a long, bright path of gold and orange across the water. I walked back to the Martha, stepped aboard, and sat on the deck, looking out at the ocean. The tide was turning, the water beginning to move slowly out toward the deep channels. I knew that the next leg of the voyage would be long, and the coastal waters could be rough in the autumn, but the boat was solid, the frames were tight, and I was ready to set the sails. The journey north took exactly 16 days. It was a voyage of blue water, white spray, and the steady, rhythmic pull of the sails. As I navigated the Atlantic coast, the warm, tropical air of Key West slowly gave way to the cooler, crisper winds of the mid-Atlantic. I spent my mornings checking the charts, verifying our coordinates, and adjusting the sail trim to catch the changing offshore breezes. At night, I dropped anchor in quiet coves along the Carolinas and Delaware, sleeping soundly in the small wooden cabin. The Martha handled the coastal chop beautifully, her wooden frames riding the swells with a natural flexibility that steel or fiberglass could never match. I spent my days at the helm, the wind in my face, watching the shoreline shift from flat green mangroves to the tall, rocky cliffs of the north. On September 26th, the sky over New York Harbor was a pale, clear blue, the morning light painting the water in shades of silver and steel. As I sailed past the Statue of Liberty and under the massive span of the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, the noise of the city began to reach me over the water. The distant hum of traffic on the Belt Parkway, the deep horns of the container ships entering the harbor, and the sharp cries of the gulls circling the mast. It was the sound of New York, a busy, crowded world that I had left behind in the snow, but which now felt different. I wasn't returning as a man who had been cast out, carrying his life in cardboard boxes on a train. I was returning as a captain of my own vessel, steering my own course through the waters. I turned the Martha into Sheepshead Bay, navigating the narrow channel between the docks and the fishing boats. The bay was alive with activity, charter boats loading up for morning trips, local fishermen washing down their decks, and people walking along the promenade. I steered the sloop toward the marina at the eastern end of the bay, where Jim Parrish had arranged a slip for me. I brought the boat alongside the wooden dock, threw the bow and stern lines to the dockmaster, and secured the cleats. I shut down the auxiliary engine, and the sudden silence was filled with the familiar smells of Brooklyn, the salt air mixed with diesel fuel, hot asphalt, and the scent of frying onions from the restaurants along the avenue. It was a noisy, messy, living neighborhood, empty of the sterile luxury of the Upper East Side, and it felt immediately real. I stepped onto the wooden deck, wiped my hands on my jeans, and looked toward the marina entrance. Sarah and Grace were already standing by the gate. Sarah was wearing a simple gray wool sweater and dark jeans, her hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. She looked thinner, and there were faint lines of fatigue around her eyes that hadn't been there when she lived on the Upper East Side. But as she stood there, her hands in her pockets, her posture was straight and steady. She didn't look like a woman waiting for her husband's approval. She looked like a woman who was standing on her own foundation. Grace stood next to her, holding her hand, wearing her favorite green winter coat. Grace saw me first. Her eyes went wide and a huge grin broke across her face. "Grandpa Arthur," she yelled, her voice carrying over the sound of the seagulls. She let go of Sarah's hand and ran down the wooden dock, her sneakers pattering against the planks. I knelt down on the deck, opening my arms as she ran toward the boat. She scrambled aboard over the wooden lifeline, throwing her arms around my neck with a force that almost knocked me over. I hugged her tight, closing my eyes as I breathed in the scent of her hair. The smell of her shampoo and the cold air of her coat was familiar and warm, a sudden wave of memories of the little girl who sat with me in the corridor on Christmas Eve. She was still wearing the little silver bracelet Martha had given her years ago. "I missed you, Grandpa," she whispered, burying her face in my shoulder. "I missed you too, Grace," I said, my voice slightly thick as I lifted her up and stood back on the deck. "You've grown a foot since I saw you last." "I have," she said, looking around the boat with wide, curious eyes. "Is this the boat you built? It's so big, and it smells like wood." "It is," I said, setting her down, "and she's a good boat. She sailed all the way from Florida." I looked up, and Sarah was standing at the edge of the dock, looking down at us. She had walked slowly down the dock while Grace was running, and she stood there now, her hands clasped in front of her. Her eyes were wet, but she was smiling, a quiet, tentative expression that had no pretense in it. "Hi, Dad," she said, her voice quiet. I stepped off the transom and stood on the wooden dock, only a few feet away from her. For a long moment, neither of us said a word. There were no grand apologies, no dramatic explanations, and no excuses. We both knew the layout of the past, and we both knew what had fallen down. Sarah stepped forward, and I opened my arms. She hugged me, her face pressed against my chest, and I could feel her shoulders shaking slightly as she held me. I wrapped my arms around her, my large, rough hands holding her tight, and I knew that this joint was solid. "Welcome home, Dad," she whispered. I looked over her shoulder at the Martha, the hull white and clean against the gray wood of the dock, her mast reaching up toward the wide blue sky. "It's good to be here, Sarah," I said. Winter came early to Stonington, Maine. By late November, the harbor water had turned the color of cold slate, and the wind off the Atlantic carried the sharp, clean bite of northern ice. I had hauled the Martha out of the water 2 weeks prior, securing her on heavy oak jackstands in the corner of the boatyard, her hull covered with a thick green canvas tarp to protect her from the winter snows. I spent my days in the small workshop behind my rented cottage, a workspace no larger than a standard garage, heated by a small cast-iron wood stove that burned scrap oak and pine cuttings. The air in the workshop was always warm, smelling of cedar shavings, beeswax, and hot coffee. I had taken to carving small wooden toys for the local children, little wooden lobster boats with tiny brass cleats and small sturdy pine cabins with shingled roofs. It was quiet, unhurried work that kept my hands busy and my mind at peace. On a Tuesday afternoon, as the first flakes of a major nor'easter began to drift past the window, the postmaster, Mark, walked down the gravel path to my workshop. He didn't mind the cold, his heavy wool coat buttoned to his chin as he pushed open the door, letting in a swirl of frosty air and the scent of the sea. "Letter for you, Gerald," Mark said, setting a white envelope on the corner of my workbench next to my carving chisels. "Came from down south. New York postmark. Thank you, Mark, I said, brushing the cedar dust from my apron. Stay for a cup of coffee? No. I have to get the mail truck back before the drifts start on the Ridge Road, he said with a brief, friendly nod. Take care, Gerald. After the door closed and the silence settled back over the workshop, I sat down on my wooden stool by the stove. I picked up the envelope. The return address was an apartment on 31st Avenue in Astoria, Queens. The handwriting was Sarah's. It was her handwriting, but it had changed since the last time I had seen it on those glossy real estate agreements. It was no longer the polished, sweeping cursive she used when she was trying to impress the Vances or sign off on corporate accounts. It was smaller, tighter, the script of someone writing late at night under the light of a single lamp. I tore open the envelope, pulled out the single sheet of yellow-lined paper and began to read. Sarah did not ask for money. She did not ask me to come home, nor did she make excuses for the choices she had made on that cold Christmas Eve on Long Island. Instead, she wrote with a quiet, flat honesty that reminded me of the letters my father used to send from the construction sites in Pennsylvania. She told me that Victor had been sentenced to 6 years at the Federal Correctional Facility in Fishkill, upstate New York. He had pleaded guilty to second-degree grand larceny, mortgage fraud, and conspiracy. His mother, Beatrice, had been forced to liquidate her luxury condo in Florida and her jewelry to pay the restitution orders and the legal fees, moving into a small, state-assisted senior apartment in New Jersey. Sarah had managed to avoid active prison time by cooperating with the district attorney's office, but she had lost almost everything else. The Merrick Roadhouse had been seized and sold at auction by the bank, and her name had been permanently removed from any corporate boards or credit registries. She had moved to Queens, renting a small, drafty 2-bedroom apartment not far from the lumber yards where Walter Higgins and I had bought timber back in the 90s. She was working as a bookkeeper for a local construction supply company, earning her own paycheck, paying her own rent, and walking to the subway every morning in the cold. But the heart of the letter was the last paragraph. Sarah had given birth to a baby boy on November 12th. She had named him Oliver after her mother's favorite uncle. "He has your eyes, Dad," she wrote, the ink slightly smudged at the edge of the page. Dark and quiet, the kind of eyes that look at a room and try to figure out how the joists are put together. I don't expect you to forgive me. I spent my whole life looking at the houses you built and calculating their square footage, instead of looking at the hands that built them. I was so afraid of being poor, so afraid of not belonging to the world Victor lived in, that I let him tear down the only solid thing I had. I am teaching Oliver how to use a wooden rule. I bought him a small block of pine from the yard, and he likes to hold it while he sleeps. When he is old enough, I want to tell him about the custom oak cabinets you made for the library in Dilworth and about his grandmother. I want him to know what a real foundation is made of. I hope you are warm wherever you are, Sarah. I sat by the wood stove for a long time, the letter resting on my lap. The only sound the quiet crackle of the oak logs burning inside the cast iron. The snow was falling heavier now, painting the dark pines outside my window in stark, silent white. I felt a strange, deep warmth in my chest. It was not the heat of victory or the satisfaction of seeing my enemies ruined. It was the quiet, structural peace of a job completed. When you spend your life building, you learn that sometimes a structure is too rotted to save. You can't patch the drywall when the sills have turned to dust and the center beam is split down the middle. You have to tear it down, clean out the debris, and expose the bare ground so that something honest can grow in its place. I stood up, walked over to my workbench, and picked up my carving knife. I took a small block of cherry wood, the wood dense and rich, and began to shave the edges, roughing out the shape of a small toy building block, the wood smooth under my fingers. I did not know if I would ever take the train back south to New York. I did not know if I would ever stand in that small apartment in Queens and hold my grandson in these rough, calloused hands. But as I looked out at the white snow, covering the harbor, and the quiet masts of the fishing boats bobbing in the distance, I knew that the foundation was secure. My daughter was working with her own hands. She was paying her own way, and she was teaching her son the value of wood and steel. I was Arthur Miller. I was 59 years old, and my life was my own. I owned a 32-foot wooden sloop, a box of old hand tools, and a small stack of dry lumber. And for the first time in my life, I knew that the structure I had built would stand.